Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, more on Rudy Gobert. We're going to dive a little bit more into the numbers on what he can provide, especially offensively for the Wolves. What do the numbers over at B-Ball Index say as we get a little more in depth? Also, Rudy Gobert was introduced to the Minneapolis media on Wednesday. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Thursday, everybody, and a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as Apple, Google, Spotify, Odyssey. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T Wolves and at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. Today on the show, I want to talk a little bit more about Gobert and get into some actual numbers. I talked more about concepts over the last few days. I want to get into some numbers and also a couple of national folks who don't necessarily feel negatively about this trade, which is the opposite of what I spent some time talking about Wednesday. There's lots of people, talking heads out there talking about how this trade makes no sense for Minnesota. There are a couple to give them credit that do like it, and I want to pull out a couple of stats that they're talking about, then a couple of things over from our friends at B-Ball Index related to support for the pairing of Gobert and Towns specifically. And then finally, we'll get into a bit of the Gobert press conference from Wednesday as well, just a couple of key quotes and takeaways from that presser. So first, I want to start with the Ringer, Kevin O'Connor at the Ringer. I mentioned him regarding the podcast, the Mismatch podcast he does with Chris Vernon, and I maybe mischaracterized a little bit. It was more Chris Vernon that really hated the trade for Minnesota. Of course, he's a Memphis guy for whatever that's worth. But Kevin O'Connor wrote a lengthy article at the Ringer at theringer.com about multiple things. The Timberwolves were the second topic after the possibility of the New Orleans Pelicans trading for Kevin Durant, but he wrote a long bit about Rudy Gobert and why he's worth the risk for the Wolves. And a lot of it is similar to what I've talked about over the past few days. But it's interesting. He does say he says literally, I'll read this, a direct quote. The Wolves are ready to take the next step. Anthony Edwards could be on the brink of superstardom. Both Karl-Anthony Towns and D'Angelo Russell are coming off the best seasons of their still young careers, and Gobert addresses the team's weaknesses from last season, namely rebounding and interior defense. Which, by the way, I've been saying since last season, that somewhere towards the end of last season, that this was arguably better than D'Lo's All-Star year in Brooklyn, and the recency bias of his poor playoff performance, fair, and I think we have to measure it. Let's not gloss over the fact that he actually was pretty good last year. He was not quite a borderline all-star, but he was a above average starting point guard, and every bit as good as he was in the injury replacement all-star year in Brooklyn a few years ago. But also the fact that he's pointing out that Ant is ready to take to be on the brink of superstardom, and the Wolves as a team are ready to take the next step. That's one of the criticisms we've heard is like, hey, Gobert is several years ahead of this Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels window. Well, Cat and D'Lo are right in the prime of of that window. Gobert's on the back, closer to the backside of his prime. Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels are 4 to 5 years away from their primes. So I don't know, I feel like you have a better chance of success if everybody's not in that exact same window within a couple of years of each other. So I think that's interesting. In terms of the actual, and of course, he also talks about perimeter defense. I spent a long time talking about that. I think it was Tuesday's show. It might have been Monday when I did a whole show just on the defense and how the Wolves perimeter defense. Actually, I talked about this quite a bit Wednesday too, when I was debunking the national narratives here. Utah's perimeter defense is one of the worst in the leagues, yet they were a top 10 defense 6 out of the last 7 years. They were 9th last year in defensive rating with terrible perimeter defenders, from Donovan Mitchell to Jordan Clarkson and aging Mike Conley and Royce O'Neal wasn't as good as he had been. Bogdanovich wasn't as good as the year went on. So the Utah Swiss cheese perimeter defense is not comparable to a defense with Jaden McDaniels, on ball Anthony Edwards, Kyle Anderson, Taurean Prince. The Wolves have better. I even said this on Wednesday. D'Angelo Russell's a better defender than Jordan Clarkson. There's no question about that. He's a bigger body. He's got a massive wingspan for his size. The Wolves just have a better perimeter defense than Utah, and that's going to make a huge difference. Now, talking about offense, I want to spend most of the rest of this show talking offense. O'Connor also digs into some interesting stats that I want to list off, and then we'll get into B-ball index here next. He talks about how the Jazz last year ranked third in the league in offensive efficiency when they're big rolled, which is, of course, almost entirely Rudy Gobert. And he says, this is quoting directly from the article. He says, so now the Timberwolves have the NBA's best roller in Gobert and the best pick and pop big in Towns. When Towns popped out of a ball screen last season, the Wolves scored 1.185 points per possession points per chance, tops in the NBA over the past 2 seasons, according to Second Spectrum. So Towns is the best pick and pop big. We'll get into some of the Gobert numbers here in a second. You could argue he's not the best roller, but his roll gravity is massive, and I'll get into a little bit what that means. And so that's one thing, right? Is arguably the best pick and roll big and the best pick and pop big in the league. You've got one of each now, and Towns is also not a bad roller. We'll talk about that too. O'Connor goes on to talk about Edwards and Russell in the pick and roll. He says out of 109 ball handlers who ran at least 500 pick and rolls last season, D'Angelo Russell was 25th in efficiency, which is actually a little bit higher maybe than I would have thought. So effectively 25th, 23rd, 24th percentile. Edwards was 60th. So not great, but pretty middle of the pack for Anthony Edwards. And then O'Connor points out they could now either have Towns or Gobert on the court for all 48 minutes. Their style disparity could make the Wolves a matchup nightmare, especially if Russell and Edwards keep improving so they can be the perimeter creators in end-of-game situations. Outside of pick and rolls, Gobert provides better vertical spacing than Vanderbilt did as a lob threat in all situations. And of course, if they need to play 5 out, he talks about putting Karl-Anthony Towns at the 5. He does say they need a couple more wings, mentions Wendell Moore's got to step up, and then talks about Kyle Anderson and Bryn Forbes as depth pieces, or Forbes, I guess, is more of a depth piece, but both those guys as important rotational pieces, really. The one name he doesn't mention, who I talked about quite a bit again Wednesday, is Jalen Noel. Does not mention Jalen Noel. Jalen Noel is going to have more of a role than Wendell Moore and Bryn Forbes from day one. So all those guys are going to have an impact on the season for sure. But let's not lose sight of the fact that Jalen Noel is going to be a major part of this team and be their primary backup backcourt option. Kyle Anderson being the primary option in the front court. This team has more depth than people think. He says they're a wing or two away. I'd say they're maybe a wing away, right? You'd like to have one more piece that's maybe a little bit better, more well-rounded than a Bryn Forbes, maybe more defensively minded than both Forbes and Jalen Noel. You'd like to have one more guy that can go in there, ironically, like a Josh Okogie type, to be like your 10th, 11th guy. Ideally, maybe not quite as limited as Josh Okogie, but someone that can come in and lock down if you need him to, can fill in if there's injuries, foul trouble, etc. But I thought that this was a really interesting, the rare positive national take on this move. And I thought it was pretty level headed. He also talks about how, they did give up maybe a little bit too much, but O'Connor understands why they did it. And it's going to make them a force to be reckoned with in the West. And he also talks about the ownership syndrome of having the new owners, who of course are not majority owners, but Mark Lorian and Alex Rodriguez influencing decisions. And, but said that that's not a bad thing, right? I mean, that's showing that not only that, but Tim Connolly running the front office now felt the need to go to ownership and say, hey, this is an important trade that we make. And all parties were agreeable to it. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. As long as it works, it's not a bad thing at all, right? So I thought that was an interesting perspective. I want to get into some of the numbers related to, I guess, everywhere, but especially offensively, some of those different pick and roll numbers, also rebounding, roll gravity, some of that great stuff. Our friends over at B-Ball Index, I want to go through those numbers. So we're going to do that here next. First, though, we're going to talk about our friends over at Rock Auto. This episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry? You have a computer with access to rockauto.com both at home and in your pocket. You can save time and money when using Rock Auto. Why choose to spend 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership? Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Their prices are reliably low for every single customer, and they have everything you could possibly need, From brake parts to tail lamps, motor oil to even new carpet, go explore their easy-to-use website today to find the solutions your auto part needs. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. All right, let's talk some numbers. Our friends over at B-Ball Index do a fantastic job of breaking down really everything. It's a great one-stop shop for comparisons, for logging all advanced metrics basically in one spot, so you're not hopping around from site to site. But I want to go through a little bit of what they have. By the way, B-Ball Index, bball-index.com. $5 a month, $50 a year. They have 500 plus player profiles, again, comparisons, etc. It's fantastic. I just went ahead and pulled up Gobert and Towns and compared the two of them, not necessarily because I'm trying to prove that one's better than the other at anything, but I think it's really fascinating. And by the way, there's been a lot said about how Gobert, everything that Gobert, all of Gobert's weaknesses, Towns is one of the best in the league at effectively, right? For this position for bigs, and all the things Towns is mediocre to has weaknesses in, Gobert's arguably the best in the league at. So they're a perfect match. And if you pull the two up in this comparison tool at B-Ball Index, there's what they call a quick rough talent comparison, and it's all these different categories: perimeter shooting, off-ball movement, one-on-one, finishing, roll gravity, playmaking, and on and on. And there's a check mark next to whichever player you're comparing that's better than the other one, and it's almost in every other situation. It's almost exactly in every other. There's only one that's not. Towns has maybe one more check mark than Gobert, which makes sense. He's a better all-around player. But it's almost exactly every other, and that's a very crude, but I think fair representation of the match of their skill sets. I think it's absolutely fascinating and kind of proves the point of Tim Connolly, right? So obviously, if you scroll through this thing, and I'm going to pull out a few that I really like. The perimeter shooting, obviously, Towns is all that. There's not much to say there. We know he's elite in terms of that off-ball movement. You'd be surprised, actually. Rudy Gobert's not bad. Obviously, not shooting off screens or anything like that. But as far as being a cutter for a big, Towns is kind of middle of the pack there as well. But when we get into roll gravity, this is where I think it starts to get really interesting. So roll gravity is effectively the impact that you have as a roll man in pick and roll game on the game. So it's not always in scoring, but it's in what that can do to impact the game. So for instance, roll man possessions per 75 possessions. So total scoring chances a player has rolling, popping, and slipping per 75 offensive possessions on the court. So this isn't strictly rolling to the rim. It's anything as the roll man, the screener in screen and roll. Rudy Gobert at 94th percentile, which grades out, of course, as an A in the league. Karl-Anthony Towns, 87th percentile, which is an A minus. Team roll man share, all these roll numbers, both these guys are in the A range. For pop impact, for points scored per 75 offensive possessions on the court from pops, Towns is 99th percentile, grades out as an A, which is in line with what the second spectrum number that Kevin O'Connor at the Ringer mentioned that I talked about in first segment, is that he's the best in the league at pick and pop. In terms of roll impact, Rudy Gobert, 93rd percentile, which is an A in roll impact per 75 possessions. By the way, Towns is 84th percentile, A minus, so not too bad himself. Slip impact, 95th percentile for Rudy Gobert when he slips a screen. It also mentions the pop to slip ratio. He only slips a screen 12% of the time. But when he does, he's 95th percentile. 88% of the time he's rolling to the rim. By the way, I thought this was interesting. It has the roll pop slip ratio here. Towns pops 54% of the time, rolls 37% of the time, and only slips 9% of the time. It's actually maybe skewed a little bit more towards rolling than I would have thought, or I should say, I would expect the pop number to be higher than 54%. Of course, screen assists are listed. That's a running joke among all NBA Twitter fans because of Jazz Twitter. But Gobert, we know, is 99th percentile in screen assists per 75 possessions. So that's fascinating. Playmaking, of course, that's all Towns. Gobert doesn't have much there. Post play, Gobert doesn't do much in terms of his post game, but paint touches are very successful for him because of his insane shooting percentage around the rim. He's 98th percentile in paint touches per 75 possessions. And of course, that's largely because of how many touches he gets in screen and roll. And so, I mean, he's great with the ball in his hands around the rim. We'll talk more about last segment. There's a little bit of some comments about lobs, the lack of lobs the Timberwolves have gotten over the past few years, and how many lobs Gobert gets. That was talked about in the press conference. Interior defense, we know that Rudy's the best. Rim deterrence, this is interesting. Rim deterrence, which I'll give the definition here at B-Ball Index, a role-adjusted measure of how a player's presence on court impacts opponents' frequency of attacking the rim. Karl-Anthony Towns has an F in rim deterrence, 14th percentile, because players are not deterred by Karl-Anthony Towns at the rim. Rudy Gobert, 99th percentile in rim deterrence, the best in the league at rim deterrence. In terms of percentage rim shots contested, contest per 75 possessions, even the block rate, Towns is actually not bad. He's B's and A's in terms of his grades there. Of course, Gobert is 93rd percentile or higher on all of these categories: rim contest, blocks, block rate, rim defensive field goal percentage versus expected. He's 99th percentile, adjusted rim points saved, 99th percentile. Towns is 70th percentile. So all of the areas where Towns is mediocre, and I think he's, by the way, better than people have given him credit for in terms of his overall defensive package. We talked about that on the show, that he was actually quite good for stretches defensively this year overall, not simply as a rim protector. But that kind of, these B-Ball Index numbers kind of bear that out. Rebounding. This is the thing that we're not talking about enough. We're talking a lot about the rim protection, and rightfully so. But offensive rebounding, Karl-Anthony Towns is like 80s, mid 80s to mid 90s percentile, B pluses to A's. But Rudy Gobert's A's across the board: offensive rebounds per 75 possession, offensive rebound chance per 75 possessions, et cetera, 96 percentile, 98, 97, 93. Interestingly, the real adjusted offensive rebound rate, which is, I'll just, again, read the definition: ridge regress offensive rebound rate, estimating the impact on team offensive rebounding ability that player's presence has. Rudy Gobert's 94th percentile in adjusted offensive rebound rate. Karl-Anthony Towns is 58th percentile. So even if you look at offensive rebound rate, Towns is decent, 78th percentile. But when you adjust it for the actual weight that the rebounds have on the game, so I believe that this is removing uncontested free throw rebounds, some of those things. Like, what's the real impact? Gobert's an A, 94th percentile. Towns is a C plus, 58th percentile. So Gobert's going to make a massive difference there. Similar story in defensive rebounding. The real adjusted defensive rebound rate, Gobert's is 78th percentile. Towns is a 42nd percentile. So Gobert is obviously a much better rebound, and that's going to matter as well, or much better rebounder, I should say, and that's going to matter as well. And I mean, all the advanced metrics, of course, love both of these guys, especially Gobert, even more so than Towns. I mean, you go and look at, just the regular like win shares, box plus minus things, but then also the LeBron metric, which is a B-ball, a proprietary B-ball index metric. Any of the other advanced metrics you find, you're going to see that Rudy Gobert is one of the top players in the league, and that's a reason why. There's a reason why Mark Laurie, who's an analytically minded owner, had I kind of identified Gobert as a potential target, because he really liked the idea of somebody with such strong advanced metric profile as Rudy Gobert. And then there's also points per possession values. I talked a little bit about this already, but in terms of pick and roll man, again, 84th percentile for Towns in terms of points per possession, 96th percentile for Rudy Gobert. Spotting up, of course, it's all Towns. The numbers for Towns are incredible across the board there in terms of his efficiency, and anytime he's shooting the ball. As a cutter, by the way, points per possession for Towns, he didn't do it a lot, but he was 96th percentile cutting out of, or as a cutter in the half court. We could see more of that if the Wolves play more Rudy Gobert pick and roll and Towns starts in the corner and he's spotting up or he's cutting. Remember the gravity of Karl-Anthony Towns. Say there's a Rudy D'Lo pick and roll, Towns, Edwards, and McDaniels on the perimeter is a lot scarier than insert any player from last year's roster that's not currently with the team now. I mean, Malik Beasley's a great three-point shooter, but there's no threat that he's going to put the ball on the floor and you could close out hard to Malik Beasley. You can't do that with Karl-Anthony Towns. If you have a 4 or 5 guarding Towns and you close out hard, he'll just blow past you and score at the rim. You can't do that with Anthony Edwards, obviously, either. And teams are going to try and close out under control and force him to shoot a three. But the amount of different things that the Wolves, now very diverse team offensively, can do is pretty staggering. And the points per possession numbers were a little bit surprising for me in terms of some of the stuff Towns can do. As a cutter, we knew he was a good spot up guy, but transition points per possession is very good. all that good stuff. And imagine him playing a little bit different of a role this year because he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to. I mean, I guess he didn't post up that much, but the offense isn't always going to run through a Karl-Anthony Towns pick and roll. He's going to be allowed to do some other things. Whereas Gobert, I mean, is a better screener than Karl-Anthony Towns. We'll see. We'll see how this all shakes out. Okay, the press conference introducing Rudy Gobert was on Wednesday. I want to hit a couple of key quotes from that here as we close the show today. First, let's talk about our friends over at Built Bar. From the people who invented healthy and tasty comes the latest gift to your taste buds. You've probably tried the amazing coconut brownie chunk Built Bar, and if you haven't, you need to. But now your friends at Built have given coconut brownie chunk the Puffs treatment. That's right, the coconut brownie chunk Built Bar flavor that you know and love, in a deliciously chewy marshmallow covered in 100% real chocolate. It's like a fluffy cloud of coconut brownie goodness. But stop drooling and listen. They're good for you. Low calorie, low sugar, high protein, and 100% delicious coconut brownie chunk puffs are only here for limited time. Go to built.com now to make sure you don't miss out. They are going fast because they taste amazing. And again, all Built Bars are made with collagen protein, which your body absorbs more efficiently and provides tons of health benefits. Eat something that tastes good and is good for you. And the best part about Built Puffs, of course, is that they taste amazing, but you can enjoy them guilt-free because they are actually good for you. They're the perfect treat, perfect when you have a craving, you need to satisfy your sweet tooth, or if you need a quick, healthy snack. They're an excellent source of protein. Delicious coconut, rich, sweet brownie, creamy marshmallow. Stop fantasizing. Get to built.com to order your box of coconut brownie chunk Built Puffs right now. The offer is built.com, promo code LOCK15. You'll get 15% off your order. Again, that's promo code LOCKed15 at built.com. All right, let's hit some of the high points from the intro presser on Wednesday. And Tim Connolly and Chris Finch spoke as well as Gobert. There's some comical comments making the rounds that Gobert made about Wolves Twitter and about Chris Finch. He said about Chris Finch, I guess first. They asked him what he knows about Finch. He had a pretty short and sweet answer. He said, "quote A really good coach that complains about my screens all the time. So now we're on the same side." Um, and I, you know, it's true. I mean, Rudy Gobert sometimes isn't the most fundamentally sound screener, but he gets away with it, right? And Finch, of course, laughed at that comment. And it goes a lot. People know Chris Finch is a good coach. Players really like Chris Finch. They know he's a good coach. So Finch's reputation precedes him. About Timberwolves fans, Gobert said, "quote I think the city has some great fans because I've seen them talking to me on Twitter for 9 years, so I know how they do," is what Gobert said about Timberwolves fans. Um, and I mean, yeah, they're going back to Andrew Wiggins dunking on the Seifel Tower several years ago. And then, of course, Gobert and Towns battles. Not that Gobert ended up actually guarding Towns that much over the past few years, but certainly Wolves Twitter has had their fun with Rudy Gobert. And of course, things are a little bit different now. He also made some interesting comments about when asked about the fit with the other guys on the roster beyond Karl-Anthony Towns. He talked about fitting with Anthony Edwards and D'Angelo Russell. He talked about spacing, talked about his own screening, providing spacing. He even brought up rim gravity, which, by the way, I just spent all this time talking about rim gravity. Gobert identified it. It's not often you hear players talking about roll gravity and rim gravity. And that's what Gobert was talking about, is he knows that he can draw the defense to him when he rolls into the paint. I mean, Rudy Gobert rolling is way different than Jared Vanderbilt rolling. It's way different than Naz Reid rolling, honestly. And Naz Reid, remember, we talked about this the other day. D'Angelo Russell and Naz Reid were a really good pick and roll combination. Naz's numbers as a pick and roll man are actually really good. And Rudy Gobert was the best in the league, arguably, certainly, top 2-3 percentile in the league in terms of roll gravity and his effectiveness at the rim, catching lobs and just pocket passes and things like that with his size and his length. Um, you know, it's going to be a major impact. Which, by the way, lobs. Speaking of lobs, another part of his answer there is he talked about how the Wolves have not thrown a lot of lobs over the past few years. That's 100% true. Chris Finch also noted in the press conference the Wolves only had 5 lob passes for dunks last season. 3 were fast break alley-oops. So 3 of their 5 lobs last season were fast break alley-oops. Gobert by himself, again, noted by Chris Finch, Gobert himself finished 87 lob passes on his own last season. It's obviously more than one per game. The Wolves the Wolves did what? One for every 12, 13 games they converted a lob pass for a dunk, and Gobert was dunking more than one lob per game. It's not going to be Lob City. We're talking Rudy Gobert's, he's not ultra athletic running the floor, prime Blake Griffin. He's not, dunks after dark Timberwolves with Zach LaVine. But he has the length and the size and also the understanding of timing and spacing and his own role, gravity, the impact he can have in the paint to be in the right place at the right time. And D'Angelo Russell's a really good passer and a good lob thrower. The Wolves just didn't have that in their arsenal last year. And they don't really have anybody. Towns isn't a big lob catcher, right? So you're talking Jaden McDaniels, maybe Anthony Edwards are really your only guys that are going to be doing that. This isn't like a completely high flying, ultra athletic team outside of McDaniels and Anthony Edwards. D'Lo and Towns are more moderate athletes, or I guess maybe modest athletes, I should say, for NBA players, of course. So it's interesting because the spacing is going to help that. If you have Towns in one corner and Anthony Edwards on the wing, you can't simply collapse the paint to try and stop a Gobert lob, because if you do, it's a kick to the corner for Towns for a corner three, or put the ball on the floor and drive, or it's a kick to Edwards for a three, or put the ball on the floor. This Wolves team, as I said a minute ago, is going to have so many weapons this year. It's just going to be a ton of fun to watch. So if you missed the presser, go back and watch it. Tim Connelly, of course, talked about how he was asked about the fit, and he talked about how Gobert doesn't inhibit anything in terms of the fit. He talked about how there were other teams, they know what Gobert's value was. There were other teams that were willing to give up similar packages. Utah didn't even want to trade him. So he joked about how Utah was actually the toughest competitor in this trade conversation. It wasn't they were bidding as much against other teams as much as Utah just didn't want to trade Gobert. They're not apparently tearing down to the studs. They plan to keep Donovan Mitchell. So according to Finch, of course he's going to say this, but this was no matter what you hear on other podcasts or blogs or whatever, there were other teams that wanted Rudy Gobert, and the Wolves gave up what they believed to be a fair price for Rudy Gobert. And also, Chris Finch talked about how in the playoffs, if teams want to play small, the Wolves just won't. They'll just play big, because if they have the two best players on the floor are both bigs, or two of the best players are both bigs, and the Wolves have them, let's try them out there and let's find a way to win. And Finch is a creative coach who can certainly do that. So go check out the presser if you haven't done that. On Friday's show, I want to talk Summer League. I want to pull out a couple of players. I ran through the roster on Wednesday's show, but I want to pull out some players in advance of Summer League, the Wolves Summer League debut Friday evening, to talk about during the show on Friday. So stay tuned for that. And of course, we'll have Summer League coverage early next week. We'll talk about the weekend in Summer League as well, and keep an eye on, of course, the free agent market. The Wolves have a couple of roster spots still to fill as well. That's all we have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. Of course, you can find this show on YouTube or any of your favorite audio platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, or Odyssey. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken, with two B's, two E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. As long as you're making us your first listen, please consider for your second listen the Locked On NBA show. You get up to date on the latest news and rumors in the NBA in just 30 minutes each day, Monday through Friday, with Locked On NBA. Locked On NBA, your daily NBA update in just 30 minutes. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.